So I turn next to the Middlesex Hospital. The directors of the Haemophilia Centre at the Middlesex Hospital were Professor Stewart until 1984, when Dr. Machin took over as director. Of course, we would have seen numerous references to the Middlesex Hospital in a range of records to Dr. Tedder and Dr. Tedder's role and in particular role in relation to testing for HTLV3 is something we'll explore perhaps in more detail in later hearings. The Middlesex was also one of the 13 designated haemophilia centres in London as at 1970, and it fell within the North West Thames region and was supplied with products by the North London Blood Transfusion Centre in Edgeware. Its 1976 allocation of NHS Factor VIII concentrate was 22 bottles per month. If we then go to BPLL 308111 and go to page 28, please. These are, again, the responses to Dr. Maycock's questionnaire. Page 28 is the response on behalf of the Middlesex Hospital as at the beginning of 1973. How many patients with haemophilia do you treat regularly? 21. And then in terms of the preference for products, the preference response by the preference expressed by Professor Stewart in his response was for some cryoprecipitate and some freeze-dried concentrate, so not just concentrate as the earlier responses we looked at were. In terms of numbers of patients treated at the Middlesex Hospital, the annual returns for 1976 through to 1985 give a range of between 8 and 22 patients with haemophilia A, between 2 and 9 patients with von Willebrand's disease, and between 1 and 5 patients with haemophilia B. The annual returns themselves, beginning in 1976, in terms of products, show relatively early use of commercial concentrates. So both Hemophilia and cryobuline were used in 1976, albeit the main treatment in 1976 by some considerable margin was cryoprecipitate. No NHS concentrates are recorded as used on the 1976 annual return. 1977, the pattern is similar. The main treatment is with cryoprecipitate. There's a small amount of NHS concentrate used and a small amount of cryobuline used. 1978, again, mainly cryoprecipitate, some NHS concentrate and a small amount of the Highland product, Hemophilia. 1979, still mostly cryoprecipitate, some NHS factor concentrates, some Hemophilia, and a very small amount of the Armour product, Factor VIII, introduced in 1979. The picture then shifts a little in 1980, and so if we go to the annual return for 1980, which is HCDO 301450, this shows 16 haemophilia A patients treated during the year 7 von Willebrand's. And then if we look at the figures, we can see cryoprecipitate looks like 4,000 bags, and then NHS concentrate 2,000 and then 12,000 units, and then the Hemophilia 20,000 units and 14,700 units. That's the picture as at 1980.
So that would equate on the usual conversion to 28,000 units of cryo.
Yes, which is a significant reduction compared to the previous years. But still not cryoprecipitate as a marginal source of treatment, which is what we've seen with some of the other centres.
Well, it's the biggest
It is.
product used per unit in hospital.
Yes, not used for home treatment. And then, if we pick the picture up in 1981, I'm sorry, HCDO 301551. It would help if I gave you the reference unit. We've got 18 haemophilia A patients treated and 7 vulnerabrands, 2 carriers. We can see that bags of cryoprecipitate is now 759. I'm just looking for present purposes at the haemophilia A patients. NHS concentrate used 10,000 and then 16,500 units for home treatment. And then we can see a range of commercial concentrates being used, coate, hemophil, cryobilin and humanate in different proportions, but all 4 in use. As well as the NHS concentrates. And then, if we go to 1982, which is HCDO 301650, we can see now cryoprecipitate is used to a lesser extent. The figure there given is roughly 10,500 units, roughly 100,000 units of NHS concentrate. Coate is used, roughly 74,000 units, and then cryobilin around 11,000 units. So that's the picture then for 1982. Cryoprecipitate usage drops. And then if we pick it up in 1983, HCDO 301747, we see there that the predominant picture is of treatment with NHS factor concentrates. So comparatively little commercial usage, although still 10,000 odd units of coate. Cryoprecipitate usage, just under 25,000, but roughly 250,000 units of NHS factor concentrates. Again, whether that simply reflects issues of supply or whether it reflects conscious decision-making is not something that we're able to detect from the returns. And then, I think finally, for present purposes, the 1984 return, which is HCDO 301841. The figures for commercial concentrates have gone up, so we've got Profilate being used just under 52,000, Factor 8, 15,600. But again, the main product in use is NHS Factor 8 concentrate, and with some usage of cryoprecipitate. Just in terms of relations with pharmaceutical companies, there is a document in relation to the Middlesex that may be worth looking at. It's BAYP 609_063. It's a letter from Linda Frith, Sales Development Manager with Qatar, and it's dated November 86. She refers to having met Dr. Machin and colleagues at the Hemostasis and Thrombosis Club meeting. There's reference in the second paragraph to checks being paid for travelling expenses and other expenses relating to a meeting. And then there's a discussion then offers of selling Qatar's Gamma-Immune product. Then if we go over the page, there's a discussion in the top paragraph about coate HT, so the heat-treated coate product offered by Qatar's at the time. And then this, in the last paragraph, I'd like to confirm that Qatar will be able to provide funds to your department of £5,000. I would like to do this in one payment before the end of this year. Would you be able to provide me with a letter saying what the funds will be used for, e.g. to help support a research project or a researcher, etc.? I should perhaps, in fairness, indicate that the 1980s, actually I don't think we have the 1987 return, so the 1986 return doesn't show any purchases from Qatar, but I'm afraid I don't have the 1987 return to check. Again, our information in relation to knowledge of risks of hepatitis or HIV really depends upon inferences to be drawn from attendance at meetings. Professor Stewart was a regular attendee at UKHCDA meetings throughout the 1970s. Dr. Machin would attend either in his own right or in place of Professor Stewart, or sometimes in place of Dr. Tedder, at meetings in the course of the 1980s. The evidence that you've received from individuals who were treated at or whose family members were treated at the hospital indicate no information, advice or warnings being provided in relation to the risks of infection. I should say that Dr. Machin has provided a statement in response to specific criticisms contained in the statement of one patient's mother, in which he said it would be normal practice for patients in 84, 85 to have discussions about the dangers of infections, particularly HIV, hepatitis B and other forms of hepatitis from any blood products provided. And he says, I would expect for this to have occurred with the patient's mother, although not necessarily directly with me. And then he refers to the fact that the records don't show whether any such discussions took place or not. The information the inquiry has from UKHCDO in terms of infections indicates one patient testing positive for HTLV3 from the Middlesex Hemophilia Centre in 1985. Again, the evidence the inquiries received from a patient treated at the hospital, or the parent of a patient treated at the hospital, gives an account of being tested for HIV without the knowledge or consent of the parent. We've little information, I'm afraid, about HCV. In fact, I think no information about HCV, either in terms of numbers or in terms of what the arrangements were for treatment of any patients infected with hepatitis C. Can I then turn to Northwick Park? The centre at Northwick Park, again, was a small centre in terms of the number of patients treated. Dr. Channerin was director of the centre in the course of the 1970s. We have then two statements from doctors who were subsequently involved. Dr. Sampson has provided a statement to the inquiry. We don't need to put it up on screen, but it's WITN 4673001. She was a consultant haematologist at Northwick Park from 1977 to 1983, and she sometimes completed the centre's annual returns. And then Dr. Reed has also provided a statement to the inquiry, again for the benefit of the transcript, it's WITN 5248001. He was registrar and senior registrar in haematology at Northwick Park from 1977 to 1982, and then took over a consultant role in 1983 at Northwick Park, I think when Dr. Sampson moved on, and he remained at Northwick Park, I think, for the majority of the rest of his medical career. In terms of facilities at Northwick Park, Dr. Sampson's description was that there was no physical entity designated Haemophilia Centre and there were no dedicated Haemophilia Centre staff. Dr. Reed's description is to similar effect. He says the centre was comprised of myself and the other haematology consultants and junior staff at Northwick Park Hospital. There were no dedicated nursing or other ancillary staff dedicated to these patients. And I should say Northwick Park Hospital was also the home to the Medical Research Council's Clinical Research Centre. And certainly Dr. Sampson, I think, was involved with the Clinical Research Centre at Northwick Park. Northwick Park was designated a haemophilia centre with associate status, so an associate haemophilia centre in 1976. We have, I think, comparatively little information about the arrangements for the provision of supplies to it in terms of contemporaneous documentation. I referred to it earlier as a very small centre, and that's borne out by the figures on the annual returns, which indicate in the period 76 to 86 up to 5 haemophilia A patients treated in a year, and then very occasionally a patient with von Willebrand's disease or a patient with haemophilia B. In terms of product usage, most years show either, or will show a combination of cryoprecipitate and NHS factor concentrates. So that's the position in 1976, cryo and NHS concentrates. In 1979, cryo and NHS concentrates. In 1980, cryo and NHS concentrates. Likewise in 1981 and in 1983, 4 and 5. There are 2 years, 1978 and 1982, in which the annual returns show a relatively small amount of the armour product factor 8 in use. So in 1978, what's described as 11 bottles or 2,640 units of armour was used. And in 1982, there's reference to, I think, 837 units of armour factor 8. So those are the years for which that commercial concentrate is identified, and the significance of that will become apparent in a moment. In terms of treatment policies and approach, we do, as I say, have a statement from Dr. Reid, and he has said this. His recollection, and I think it's fair to point out that he didn't, I think, have all the annual returns when he made his statement. His recollection was that until the advent of the NHS 8Y product in 1985, cryoprecipitate was used in most or all cases. His statement indicates that patients were not consulted over decisions as to which products to use, but concerns may have been discussed with them. And he says this in his statement: our product policy was determined by what we perceived to be in the best interests of our patients. I do not recall consulting with them over our decisions, though that does not mean that we did not discuss any of their concerns with them. And then he says this: until the NHS heat-treated products came along, I was unhappy and did not consider using any other alternative, except for DDAVP in mildly affected cases or in von Willebrand's disease. Dr. Reid also says this: I remember not being convinced of the safety of early commercial preparations because of their American provenance and what I understood about their donor pool. I was happier, therefore, to persist with cryoprecipitate until the UK product became available, although I note we used Profilate in 1986. I cannot recall the reason for this at the time. As I say, he did not, I think, have access to all the earlier annual returns when he gave his statement. The inquiry has evidence from or about 2 patients treated at Northwick Park, but both anonymous, and so I'm going to be careful in terms of what I say. We have evidence from an anonymous witness with severe haemophilia A, treated at the Hemophilia Centre. He describes in his statement being treated initially with fresh frozen plasma and then cryoprecipitate. Then he describes a move towards treatment with factor concentrates, and his statement says this: I was not comfortable changing my treatment from cryoprecipitate to factor 8 and sat down with my doctors at Northwick Park Hospital in Harrow and told them that I did not want to be treated with factor 8. I felt relatively safe using cryoprecipitate, and unusually the doctors agreed to allow me to continue with the treatment, despite the fact it was uncommon for haemophilia patients to be allowed to elect their treatment. They were very helpful and, like all of us, uncertain of the nature and scale of the threat posed by HIV. My doctors provided me with a steady supply of circa 20 units of cryoprecipitate to keep in the freezer to treat bloods on demand. That patient did, in fact, contract both HIV and HCV, but the evidence suggests that that was because of treatment at a different hospital in London, out-of-hours treatment, in which he was treated with a commercial concentrate, which infected him with HIV. However, there's a different picture that emerges in the statement of, again, an anonymous, a parent whose son was treated at Northwick Park Hospital. She describes this. He was treated for the first 4 years of his life with cryoprecipitate, but from 1978 onwards he was transferred to factor VIII concentrate. I was advised by the hospital that the use of factor VIII would be a great improvement in his care, allowing us to eventually go on home treatment. I was never asked if I was agreeable to the change, and I was never informed that there was a risk of viruses being carried in the blood product. The hospital said that the factor VIII was purer. I was told it would make life simpler and easier for us, and that the home treatment would reduce the number of hospital visits and disruption to our home life. You will recall, sir, that I mentioned those small amounts of armour products appearing in the 1978 and 1982 returns. And unhappily, the UK HCDO records in relation to the child treated at Northwick Park indicate that he was the recipient of armour factor VIII in 1978 and in 1982 from Northwick Park. The patient's mother's statement to you, sir, continues. In 1983, HIV was a hot topic in the news and there were suggestions that haemophiliacs were susceptible. And she describes contacting Northwick Park, being told to carry on her son's home treatment as normal, as the risk of him contracting an infection was minimal. She was not given an option for her son to revert to cryoprecipitate. She says in her statement, mostly the treatment was NHS factor VIII, but if they were running low, he would be given commercial products. And as I say, the UK HCDO records confirm that. I should also say that her statement describes being informed of her son's HIV positive test result by a letter from Northwick Park. And so you'll see, sir, the picture that emerges there, you may think is somewhat different from the account in the witness statements from clinicians that the inquiry has received. I've referred in relation to an earlier centre to some of the evidence of Dr. Sampson and her recollection that it wasn't until a later stage that the severity of non-A, non-B hepatitis was appreciated. She says in her statement, and this is describing, I think, the position as at the summer of 1983, we felt blood products were very safe. She talks about becoming aware only of the risks in relation to HIV when she moved from Northwick Park to Charing Cross Hospital in 1984. We don't know what the reasons were for there being some use of the commercial concentrate at Northwick Park in 78 and 82, as described. Dr. Reed's recollection was that supply was not an issue and that they could get unlimited amounts of cryoprecipitate. But as I say, it's right to point out that he did not have either the information from the full returns or indeed the statement from the patient's mother to which I've referred. In terms of the arrangements for testing for HTLV3, Dr. Reed recalled arrangements being made to test the 3 haemophilia A patients in 1985 at the time of trying to make the arrangements to obtain heat-treated concentrate. And we can see, if we go to, sorry, forgive me when I check the reference. Yes, CBLA 0002033. This is a letter that Dr. Reed wrote to Dr. Snape at BPL in February 1985, asking for heat-treated concentrates to be made available. And he identifies there 3 patients for whom heat-treated concentrates were being sought. So you may wish to ignore what's written in handwriting on the right-hand side, because we know that that's not entirely accurate. So there's what's recorded there for the second identified patient as negative. We know that that's the child who later in 1985 was found to be positive for HTLV3. So we don't know who wrote that, but that's not accurate. But you'll see what's then said at the end of the letter is, in the meantime, we're conducting investigations to ascertain their HTLV3 status. And certainly in relation to the child to whom I've referred, it was around September of 1985 when the letter was sent communicating the HTLV3 positive test result. The evidence that the inquiries then received in that regard from the parent of the patient treated there is consistent with the data that UKHCDO had supplied to the inquiry, which suggested one patient testing positive for HIV at Northwick Park in 1985. There is, I'm afraid, no real information in terms of hepatitis C. Dr. Reed's recollection was that testing and monitoring for hepatitis C would have been undertaken at the Royal Free Hospital, which became the comprehensive treatment centre from the 1990s onwards. But he was unable to cast any further light on any issues relating to hepatitis C. So that's the picture in relation to Northwick Park, a small centre, a small number of patients, but perhaps really quite revealing in terms of what it tells us about relative risks and indeed practices in terms of the provision or non-provision of information and advice to patients. Can I then turn to Edgeware? The Haemophilia Centre at Edgeware Hospital was led in terms of directorship by Dr. Ardeman from 1977, certainly until 1990, possibly later. Edgeware was designated as an associate centre late in 1976. It was part of the North West Thames region, so Region 5, and received, at least at that point in the 70s, its NHS concentrates from the North London Blood Transfusion Centre in Edgeware. Dr. Ardeman attended some of the meetings of directors of centres and blood transfusion centres that we've looked at, 76, 77 and 78. I'm not going to go to those meetings again, largely because although Dr. Ardeman made contributions at the meetings, they were contributions which related more generally to the supply arrangements in the Regional Health Authority area, rather than anything specific to the needs of or usage of products at the Edgeware Haemophilia Centre. Again, it was a very small centre. The number of patients taken from the annual returns from 1976 to 86 suggests between 1 and 4 Haemophilia A patients, 2 von Willebrands and no Haemophilia B patients treated. The picture from the returns in terms of the products that were used is as follows. Only cryoprecipitate in 1976 and 1977. In 1978, cryoprecipitate NHS factor 8 concentrate and the Highland product, Hemophil. The factor used, the product used most in that year was the NHS factor 8 concentrate. 1979 shows usage of both NHS factor 8 concentrate and cryobulin. That was for the treatment of a single patient in that year. In 1980, we can't discern the figures from the return, but the products that were used were cryoprecipitate NHS concentrate and Highland product in relation to the treatment of Hemophilia A. 1981, again, shows continuing use of cryoprecipitate. The figures are all relatively small because of the small numbers of patients, but also use of NHS factor 8 concentrate, Hemophil and cryobulin. In 1982, again, it's cryoprecipitate, NHS concentrate, and haemophil, no cryobulin in that year. In 1983, there's only one haemophilia A patient treated, so it may be difficult to make any particular deductions, but it's treatment with cryoprecipitate only, and it looks like it's for home treatment. There doesn't appear to have been any factor VIII concentrate, whether NHS or commercial, used at Edgeware in 1983. We don't, I think, have the return for 1984. 1985 again shows the treatment of only one patient, and that was with a commercial product, the Armour product, factor VIII, and that's in hospital. No home treatment appears to have taken place in 1985. 1986, and this again shows the size of the centre, no patients treated and no blood products therefore used. We've no direct information again about the knowledge of risks on the part of Dr. Arderman. He did attend UKHCDO meetings on occasion, so 77, 81 and 82, which are fairly important meetings. And he sent his apologies on a number of other occasions. And again, it may be reasonable to assume that he would have received the minutes of those meetings. The data that the inquiry has received from UKHCDO suggests that there were no patients infected with HIV in the Edgeware Hospital. There's evidence to suggest 2 patients were tested to see whether they were HTLV positive, but no positive test results. We have, I'm afraid, no information at all in relation to hepatitis C. The next London centre that I wanted to look at is the Haemophilia Centre at the Hillingdon Hospital. The director there during the 70s and 80s was Dr. Britt. Again, it was an associate centre, designated as such in late 1976, and supplied with NHS concentrates by the North London Blood Transfusion Centre in Edgeware. You'll recall we looked this morning at a document which showed allocations as at 1976 of factor VIII concentrates, numbers of bottles per month to certain centres. The documents show no allocation to Edgeware, and presumably, to Hillingdon, presumably because it was a newly designated associate centre, so there was no established pattern of usage. The annual returns show, in terms of numbers of patients treated, 2 patients with haemophilia A and 1 with Christmas disease in 1976. And then over the years that follow, the numbers remain small. I think the largest number treated in a given year with haemophilia A is 6. Occasionally a patient with von Willebrand's disease was treated. Occasionally a patient with haemophilia B was treated. I can again take the product usage from the annual returns, I think, by way of summary. Cryoprecipitate only in 1976 and 1977. In 1978, cryoprecipitate and NHS concentrates. In 1979, cryoprecipitate and NHS concentrates, but also Armour factor VIII. Again, the volumes used are all small because the number of patients being treated was very small. But we see that commercial product being used in 1979. 1980, again, is a mixture of cryoprecipitate, NHS factor VIII concentrates, and Armour's factor VIII to treat 2 patients in hospital. 1981 seems to suggest no NHS concentrates used. There was a small amount of cryoprecipitate used, and then the treatment was with the Armour product and with Immuno's cryobulin. Again, relatively small amounts in terms of overall usage. 1982 shows a slightly larger volume of concentrate being used, so roughly 70,000 units of factor VIII, the Armour product, and just under 21,000 units of cryobulin. Cryoprecipitate was used, but only for the treatment of von Willebrand's disease in that year. 1983 shows cryoprecipitate being used in that year for the treatment of haemophilia A patients, but also NHS concentrates and just under 53,000 units of the Armour product used in 1983. 1984 shows cryoprecipitate and NHS concentrates. No commercial concentrates appear to have been used. There's not much by way of evidence of Dr. Britt himself attending UK HCDO meetings. He largely seemed to send his apologies, but there were clinicians from Hillingdon Hospital recorded as attending UK HCDO meetings on Dr. Britt's behalf in 1977, 79, 81, 83 and 85. And again, it may be reasonable to infer that he would have been sent copies of the minutes and would have had available to him the discussions recorded in the minutes about hepatitis and HIV. The data received by the inquiry from UK HCDO suggests no patients at Hillingdon tested positive for HIV. There's no information, I'm afraid, that we've unearthed from the hospital in relation to infection with hepatitis C for patients of the Haemophilia Centre. There is evidence in relation to patients infected with hepatitis C by way of transfusion. And of course, those are issues that we'll be exploring in more detail in later hearings. I'm just going to read out the reference for a letter from a patient who was the subject of an operation at the Hillingdon Hospital in June 1991, and the significance of the date is apparent shortly before the introduction of hepatitis C screening in the autumn of 1991, who was then identified on a look-back exercise in late 95, early 96. It's a very powerful and telling account in a letter he wrote to his local MP. And for the transcript, it's DHSC 0004728_180. So there is some important information from Hillingdon in relation to infection by way of transfusion with hepatitis C, but nothing from the documentation in relation to the position of haemophilia patients and the extent to which they were infected with hepatitis C. So I note the time. I've got 3 more London hospitals to cover, but I don't think I can do justice to them in a matter of a few minutes, so perhaps we could pick those up at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Yes, well, let's do that then. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning to complete London and then move into the southwest?
South and southwest, and then East Anglia.
10 o'clock.